Miigwech. Miigwech. Nuakumaganak. Miigwech. Anshinoak. Kiwet nung kayawat. Umagaya mihtamoaganuwat. Gwenagawashak isnigan. Kenstagwat. Gwenage kumshumananak, kokumananak, tuskadzimnanak, kayamihtamoek. Speaker, Miigwech, for allowing me to be able to stand up in this place. Over the last 7 years that I've learned is still colonial. I will say this, Speaker, this government cannot and will not special economic zone our lands, period. Speaker, we should not be here today. This government has avoided every opportunity to meaningfully engage with First Nations on Bill 5. They have been told to start over by First Nations. They have been told by rights holders that they must be at the table when legislation like this is created, not be consulted afterwards. Over here, we have used all available legislative tools, but the government insists on using its majority to stifle debate and minimize opportunities for democratic processes, just like the contents of Bill 5 itself. In committee hearings, we heard from many First Nations, many leaders who told us what we've heard before. First Nations are not against development, but development can only go ahead with the proper consultation and in respect of the free principles of free, prior, and informed consent.
Hear, hear.
This includes the right to say no. We heard a similar message from many of the hundreds of First Nations organizations and people who submitted written comments. This government has harmed relationships with First Nations and will harm the relationships with First Nation leadership. And this government has demonstrated their willingness to violate First Nations treaty, Aboriginal, and inherent rights. Speaker, the final stage, the Royal Assent, which will officially put Bill 5 into law, will mark the symbolic breaking of the Crown's treaties and agreements with First Nations in Ontario. I want to acknowledge the many rights holders joining us in the galleries for this vote. We are joined by Deputy Chief Cecilia Begg and Councillor Sam McKay from Kitchener-Mexip in Innuit. In 2008, both were politically imprisoned, along with the chief and three other councillors for peaceful actions that they took to defend their territory from unwanted mining by Platniks. The KI6 were sentenced to 6 months in jail after being charged with contempt. At the time, John Cutfeet, who defended the KI-6 to the court, said that First Nations gained the right to sit at the table, but they don't have the right to leave the table, which is not legitimate consultation. Speaker, in the end, Ontario announced it would pay Platniks $5 million to surrender their exploration claims near Kichinamek-Sipininawa. The leadership of Kichinamek-Sipininawa continue to advocate for the right to say no. I know there's a lot happening in the country. The north is covered in smoke. We see a pattern emerge from governments across the country who are bringing forward legislation like Bill 5, aims to fast-track projects of national interest. For First Nations who value nation-to-nation relationship with the Crown in the treaties that were signed, this forces us to ask, whose national interests do these bills serve? Whether it's the Premier, whether it's the Prime Minister, or President Trump, the rhetoric and the legislation are attacks on First Nations' inherent rights, treaty rights, and Aboriginal title. I want to emphasize again that First Nations are not against development, but development and economic ventures must be done right. This means on our terms as rights holders. It needs to happen with proper consultation. The Government of Ontario has an unfortunate record of telling First Nations what they need instead of listening to what First Nations are actually saying. We, as First Nations, are not okay with that. As Grand Chief of Association of Iroquois and Allied Indians, Joel Abram shared in a press conference last week, quote, "Economic reconciliation without legal and moral responsibility is just another form of coercion," end quote. This government cannot use the promise of economic opportunity or investment to try to get consent. That is not how free, prior, informed consent works. You cannot just buy us off with $3.1 billion. We are worth more than that. Consent must be freely given. More and more, First Nations leadership and rights holders are speaking out to say, if these pieces of legislation and projects move forward without the consent, these are their words, they will once again be idle no more. Though this vote may mark the last stage of this legislative process, make no mistake that this vote is not the end of the conversation. You don't need to look further than the galleries that we see up here to see that the resilience of these rights holders. Or you could look at the front lawn on Monday, where hundreds of rights holders, leaders, gathered outside to say our rights are not for sale. We had representation from across Ontario and even the country, including Assembly of First Nations National Chief Cindy Woodhouse and former National Chief Phil Fontaine, Chiefs of Ontario Regional Chief Abram Benedict, the Snabaski Nation Grand Chief Alvin Fiddler, and Snabeg Nation Grand Council Chief Linda Dubasige, Association of Iroquois and Allied Indians, Joe Abram. The message is strong, Speaker, and even stronger still was the showing of unity. The more oppressed we are, the stronger we become as nations. This government's colonial tactic of attempting to divide and conquer of our nations is failing. First Nations rights holders are coming together instead, stronger and more unified than ever to assert their right, their sovereignty, and their jurisdiction over the lands we live since time immemorial. Yeah. It's always important to talk about the issues that are happening on the land. It's important that in the North, in Treaty 9 territory, the homelands, we are so rich in the lands that we have. That's where the language comes from. That's where the identity comes from. The teachings of our people, that's where it comes from. And it does not cost $3.1 billion. I want to share this quote, shared by at the committee from Chief Archie Wabas, Winema Lake First Nation. Quote, "Let it be known, we are not stakeholders, we are rights holders. Our treaties are not optional. Our voices will not rest until the Crown honors its obligation to engage peacefully with us in a true and meaningful treaty relationship, one based on recognition, respect, and reconciliation at the nation-to-nation table. This bill does not do that. This government has totally failed in the truth and reconciliation of where we want to go. But again, I just would like to close by sharing what rights holders continue to remind us. If the treaties are violated, the land will revert to its original occupants and stewards. Miigwech.